Let's turn now to Ukraine, where the capital city remains under siege. And this just in from President Zelensky. A full-scale attack on the city could happen tonight. There are new satellite images that show about 150 helicopters along with large battalions of Russian ground troops just over the border in Belarus. The crisis also triggering fears of a humanitarian disaster, with tens of thousands of Ukrainians forced from their homes. Russian troops are closing in on major cities from the east, south, and north. And CBS's Charlie D'Agata is in Kyiv tonight. Good evening, Charlie.
Good evening, Nora. In a national address, the
Hold up and analyze. Come on, get some. Listen close as I prove my point. We do our thing, son. Hold up and analyze. Come on, get some. Listen close as I prove my point. Ready to make an entrance, so crack.
Before we talk about the war, let's rewind to the very beginning, to the very start of this crisis. The first thing we need to do is to figure out how all of this started. 2 years ago, people in Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, came out to mass protest against the decision by then-President Viktor Yanukovych to postpone the signing of an economic treaty between Ukraine and the European Union. Yanukovych argued that completely opening up the Ukrainian economy to European goods would hurt local producers, because they wouldn't be able to compete with cheaper and heavily subsidized European goods. This, in turn, would cause producers to go out of business, countless layoffs, and significantly hurt the economy. He didn't abandon the treaty completely, but just postponed its signing in order to better prepare the Ukrainian economy for new realities. Since Yanukovych was seen as a corrupt president prone to cronyism, his political and business opponents used the postponement of the treaty in order to mobilize the Ukrainian people into a movement called the Euromaidan. While the majority of protesters were initially peaceful, anti-Yanukovych oligarchs, who actually made their vast fortunes and corrupt schemes stealing from the people of Ukraine, now sponsored the movement for their own financial gain, also paid radical nationalists to battle the police, drawing peaceful protesters into the crossfire. Blood was spilled on both sides, many people tragically died, and the police and the government, in order to save lives, backed down. Thus, Yanukovych, the legitimate, constitutional, and democratically elected president, was overthrown in a nationalist coup, sponsored by the very same oligarchs who stole billions of dollars from the people of Ukraine. By the way, after overthrowing Yanukovych, the new leaders also postponed the signing of the treaty that would open up Ukraine to European goods, for the same reason, in order to better prepare the economy, just like Yanukovych wanted. Thus, the treaty was just a pretext used to mobilize the people to achieve the oligarchs' political and financial goals, basically to make some more cash. Western governments obviously wanted the Ukraine market to open up to their goods and to bring Ukraine into their orbit. And they didn't really care what pain it would cause to the Ukrainian economy and actively supported anti-government protests, both morally by coming to Kiev and financially. The US State Department admitted to having spent $5 billion of US taxpayers' money to help foster anti-government protests. And US Undersecretary of State Victoria Nuland, in her famous
"Fuck the EU"
intercept, discusses with the US ambassador in Ukraine which protest leader would hold what post in the future government. Now, just imagine this happening in the United States or Europe. Russia or China sponsoring anti-EU rallies in Greece or Spain, or anti-government rallies in the US for that matter, or Russian Foreign Ministry actively donating money to one political party, coming to their rallies, and then telling them who would run what ministry. It's complete nonsense, right? So after the nationalist coup in Kiev, the first act of the so-called revolutionary parliament was to repeal a law giving language rights to Russian speakers. Since the vast majority of southeast Ukraine is Russian-speaking, they came out to protest this, and to demand that the revolutionary central government respect their basic rights. They also wanted for Ukraine to become a federation. Many of the most prominent countries in the world are federations, where people have both local as well as federal elections. Brazil, India, Canada, Germany, and many others have federal forms of government. The United States, at the time of its creation, also had Federalist and Anti-Federalist parties. George Washington, as well as most founding fathers, were Federalists. But in Ukraine, the president in Kiev appoints governors to all the regions of Ukraine, and the people of the region don't have a say about it. Just imagine if somebody in Washington, D.C. appointed the governor of Arizona or Massachusetts. How happy would the people there be? Especially if the government in Washington was actively hostile and disrespectful to the people of that state.
expressed a desire to travel to Ukraine to fight with a far-right paramilitary group.
At least one member of an American hate group also trained in Ukraine with Azov Battalion.
However, despite hundreds of thousands of people in South and East Ukraine coming out to peaceful rallies calling for Ukraine to become a federation and to have guaranteed minority rights, the government in Kiev completely ignored their calls, branded them separatists and later terrorists, and refused to talk to them. And when some of the protesters occupied and peacefully held few government buildings, just like the protesters did during the Euromaidan in Kiev before, letting people come to work and go from work every day without really disrupting the work process, the central government, instead of trying to negotiate with the federalists, declared the entire Donbas region a terrorist zone, started bombarding cities with heavy artillery and air force, destroying the local infrastructure, killing countless civilian, elderly, women and children. Obviously, when the death toll started to rise, and when the Ukrainian forces in cities that they held started acting like marauding occupational force, stealing from locals, abusing the citizens, kidnapping and even executing people who didn't disagree with the regime, or just kidnapping people for ransom, more and more people started to organize themselves in order to fight back. And the people of Eastern Industrial Region of Donbas declared Donetsk Republic and Lugansk Republic, where the rights and freedoms of people would be respected. So after the republics were declared by local activists, both republics held democratic referendums with Western observers present, where locals overwhelmingly supported the creation of the new political entities. But they still didn't go as far as declaring independence, and still appealed to Kiev to negotiate the federalization of the country, where regions and people in various regions would have guaranteed rights. But instead of negotiating, Kiev responded by sending in the army and nationalist battalions who started indiscriminately bombing civilian areas. Obviously, local people had no choice but to take up arms to defend their land. And those are the people fighting on the front lines today. Locals, people who used to be miners or office clerks, fighting for their freedom from government oppression, fighting for their lands, their homes, and their families. May Day Barbecue. That was a popular joke about over 50 unarmed people burned alive in Odessa on the 2nd of May of 2014. Women. These are female insects. Didn't you study biology in school? F them. There are no people in Lugansk. Only carpet bombing can save them. 450,000 amoebas deserving to be wiped out. When we kill them, just keep in mind, these are not humans.
Today, just to drive my point of Ukrainian hatred towards Donbas home, I have compiled some quotes from Ukrainian politicians, military leaders, and public figures. I could have shown thousands of these.
Ми ніколи не змінимо цього агресора. Хіба маємо один шлях – знищити Москву. Задля цього і живемо. Задля цього прийшли в цей світ, аби знищити Москву. Не просто москаля на наших землях, аби знищити цю чорну діру європейської безпеки.
That's Irina Farion, a member of parliament. In her views, Moscow is the internal enemy, and anyone who sympathizes with Russia or dares to speak the Russian language, like the vast majority of people in southeast Ukraine, are traitors and need to be wiped out, or filtered out. In this phone intercept, former Prime Minister and current head of one of Ukraine's biggest parties, Ms. Yulia Tymoshenko, answers the question of what to do with 8 million ethnic Russians in Ukraine. Listen to her answer.
А что теперь делать оставшимся 8 миллионам русских, которые остались на территории Украины?
Блин, их расстреливать из атомного оружия.
Kill 8 million people with nukes for their ethnicity. Sounds like a plan. Bogdan Butkevich, a well-known Ukrainian journalist, is much kinder. Not all citizens of Donbas need to be killed. Only 75 to 80% are in that category of people.
Якщо брати навіть чисто Донецьку область, там приблизно 4 мільйони населення. Щонайменше 1,5 мільйона там просто зайвих людей, їм не буде роботи ніколи. Нам не треба розуміти Донбас, нам треба розуміти взагалі український національний інтерес. А Донбас треба просто використати як ресурс. Корисних людей для України відсотків, за моїми розрахунками, відсотків 20-25. Найголовніше, що треба зробити в даний момент, як це там жорстоко не прозвучить, є певна категорія людей, яких треба просто вбити.
However, others have more ingenious plans as well. Here, the mayor of Dnipropetrovsk, Ukraine's second largest city, has the following idea. Let's promise these bastards in this case ethnic Russians, anything they want and give them any guarantees they want. As for hanging, we'll start hanging them later. Democratic, right? And of course, this list would not be complete without the following quote from President Poroshenko. This is what he says about people who are supposedly his citizens and who he supposedly wants to liberate.
У нас робота буде, у них немає. У нас пенсії будуть, у них немає. У нас піклування під дітей, під людей, під пенсіонерів, під дітей буде, у них немає. У нас діти підуть до школи і до дитячих садків, у них вони будуть сидіти в підвалах. У нас діти підуть до школи і до дитячих садків, у них вони будуть сидіти в підвалах.
Their kids will be hiding in basement bomb shelters, while our kids will be in schools and kindergartens. That's the love Donbass gets from the president. The president who is self-styled peacekeeper, by the way. Again, are there any questions while the people here are fighting and dying to keep such peacekeepers out of their homes?
All the lies that you told, now the world knows that you're just a monster. It shows your true colors. I see it clearly, you're a liar. All the things you said you would do, all the lies I see through. Now the world knows your true colors.